When America entered the Second World War, it faced a problem of scale that seemed impossible to solve. Germany had been preparing for years, training its soldiers through a professional system built on long service, discipline, and experience. Many of the Wehrmacht's tank crews in 1944 had been fighting since the first blitzkriegs in Poland and France. By contrast, the United States had an army that was still small in 1941 and had to transform millions of civilians into combat-ready troops almost overnight. What made the difference was not trying to imitate the German model but building a uniquely American program, rapid, standardized, and matched perfectly to mass production. This system took farmhands, mechanics, students, and office clerks and turned them into tank crews and infantry squads within weeks, sending them into battle against veterans who had spent years in the field. Against all expectation, it worked, and the rapid training program became one of the hidden engines of Allied victory. The American approach to training was not about polishing individuals for years. It was about efficiency. In armored units, new recruits could expect 6 to 8 weeks of concentrated preparation. During this time, they learned the essentials of operating the M4 Sherman, from driving across rough ground to firing its 75mm gun. They were drilled on maintenance routines, target recognition, and communication, but always with the understanding that they would learn more in combat. Infantrymen, the backbone of the army, went through longer camps, often around 13 weeks, but even this was far shorter than the months or years that European armies had invested in their troops. Critics at the time worried that these soldiers were too green. Yet what mattered was not the duration of training, but how well it fit into a broader system designed for mass mobilization. The key lay in the deliberate simplicity of American weapons and doctrine. The Sherman tank was not a masterpiece of engineering like the Panther or the Tiger. It was a workhorse. Its controls were laid out so that someone who had driven a farm tractor or a delivery truck could learn them in days. Its mechanical parts were shared with thousands of other vehicles. Its design emphasized reliability, not complexity. For a German tanker, mastering the Panther meant months of specialized instruction and years of maintenance practice. For an American tanker, learning the Sherman was closer to learning to drive a car. The difference was profound. American crews could be trained quickly and effectively because their machines were built to be operated by ordinary citizens, not by an elite warrior caste. Standardization amplified this effect. Every infantry recruit trained on the same M1 Garand rifle, every tanker practiced on Shermans, every driver handled standardized trucks. Radios, ammunition, and spare parts were identical across units. This meant that a replacement sent to the front could integrate into any platoon without hesitation. He already knew the weapons, the procedures, and the expectations. By contrast, German units often struggled with diversity in equipment. Some divisions used Panzer IVs, others Panthers, a few had Tigers, and many had captured or improvised vehicles. Each required different ammunition, different spare parts, different maintenance. Training a German replacement was far more complicated, and inserting him into a unit often demanded weeks of adjustment. The American system also relied on mass production to back up rapid training. A new tank crew might lose its Sherman in its first battle, but factories were turning out 2,000 replacements every month. Each one was virtually identical, so crews could step into a new vehicle without retraining. Mechanics in the field could cannibalize parts from any other Sherman or standard truck. The logistical machine that supported the U.S. Army meant that green crews could afford to learn in combat because the system absorbed their losses and kept units fighting at full strength. For the Germans, a lost Tiger or Panther was irreplaceable, and a destroyed veteran crew was a blow that training schools could not easily repair. Training camps across the United States reflected this philosophy. At places like Fort Knox for tankers and Camp Wheeler for infantry, recruits drilled from dawn to dusk. They marched, fired live ammunition, learned to repair engines, and practiced tactical maneuvers on mock battlefields. Instructors emphasized teamwork and coordination above individual brilliance. Soldiers were told again and again that their strength lay not in personal heroics, but in functioning as a unit supported by overwhelming firepower and logistics. This mindset mirrored the industrial system behind them. Interchangeable parts, interchangeable soldiers, all working together in a machine that would grind down the enemy. The results shocked German veterans. They expected replacements arriving at the front to be clumsy and ineffective, but instead found American units that quickly adapted under fire. The reason was that the U.S. system allowed rapid learning. A crew that survived its first engagement would already be twice as effective in the second. Lessons spread quickly through standardized manuals, shared equipment, and constant rotation of personnel. Experience, once gained, could be transferred across the Army much faster than in a force that prized individual expertise. One striking example came during the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944. American armored divisions were filled with crews who had been civilians less than a year earlier. They faced German tank battalions commanded by men who had fought in Russia and North Africa. On paper, the Germans should have swept the battlefield. Instead, the Americans used numbers, coordination, and the resilience of their system to push forward. Green crews lost tanks, but replacements arrived immediately. Within weeks, those same crews had gained battlefield experience, and the tide turned. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy, the supposedly inexperienced American force was operating with a confidence and effectiveness that surprised even their own commanders. The training program was also psychological. American soldiers were taught that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Unlike German propaganda, which emphasized the elite nature of its soldiers, U.S. training stressed the role of the citizen army. A recruit understood that he was one of millions, that his task was to do his part, not to stand out as a hero. This created resilience. When one man fell, another could step into his place without disrupting the system. Units absorbed losses and continued forward, powered by the belief that the war was being fought by ordinary men achieving extraordinary things together. Another critical element was the focus on practical skills. American training minimized theory and concentrated on what soldiers would actually face. Tank crews fired live rounds, practiced gunnery on moving targets, and simulated mechanical breakdowns. Infantry trained with live grenades, crawled under machine gun fire, and rehearsed combined arms assaults with artillery and tanks. Every exercise was designed to reflect combat conditions as closely as possible. The idea was not to create perfect soldiers, but adaptable ones. When they arrived in Europe, the terrain, the enemy, and the conditions were different from training camps, but the soldiers already knew how to react under stress. This practicality extended to maintenance. German vehicles required highly skilled mechanics who had often spent years in training. American training taught every soldier to perform basic repairs. Tank crews could replace tracks, change parts, and fix engines in the field without waiting for specialists. Infantrymen learned to clean and service their weapons daily. This culture of self-reliance meant that American units could keep moving even when conditions were harsh. Equipment stayed in service longer, and breakdowns that might immobilize a German vehicle for days were fixed by American crews in hours. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the rapid training program was its ability to scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. Army expanded from under 200,000 regular soldiers to over 8 million men in uniform. Training camps processed tens of thousands at a time, using standardized curricula, identical equipment, and rotating instructors. It was an industrial approach to training, mirroring the industrial approach to production. No other country in the war managed to mobilize such vast numbers so quickly while still maintaining combat effectiveness. Critics within the Army admitted that the system produced uneven results. Some units entered combat unprepared and paid a heavy price, but the system was forgiving. Losses could be replaced, experience could be shared, and new units could be raised without crippling the war effort. The Germans, by contrast, could not replace their veteran losses. Every destroyed tank crew was irreplaceable, every lost officer a blow to the unit's cohesion. The American system accepted that individuals would be lost, but ensured that the Army as a whole grew stronger over time. The rapid training program was not glamorous, and it did not produce elite soldiers in the traditional sense. But it created an army that could absorb the shock of modern warfare, adapt quickly, and continue advancing no matter the losses. It was a system built for a democratic nation, drawing on the talents of ordinary citizens and supported by the world's most powerful industrial base. When American crews, trained for only weeks, faced German veterans who had been fighting for years, the outcome was not always clean or easy. Yet time and again, the Americans held their ground, learned fast, and eventually overcame. The Wehrmacht, with all its experience and tradition, could not compete with a system that turned millions into soldiers faster than they could be defeated. In the end, the rapid training program represented more than just a military solution. It was a reflection of American society, pragmatic, efficient, and confident in the power of organization and industry. It proved that wars in the modern age would not be won solely by elite forces or by years of preparation, but by the ability to mobilize entire nations quickly and effectively. The young Americans who had once been farmers, students, and mechanics showed that with the right system behind them, they could stand against the most experienced army in the world and prevail. The German army entered the Second World War with a reputation for unmatched skill on the battlefield. Its officers were professionals, its troops were drilled in precision, and its armored units had already crushed Europe with lightning war. By 1944, many German soldiers had years of combat behind them, hardened in the deserts of North Africa and the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. Facing them were Americans who had been in uniform for only months. On paper, there was no contest. Yet time and again, those American units found ways to outplay the veterans. The key was not experience, but tactics, an approach built around mobility, coordination, and the combined use of every available weapon. Where German forces relied on tradition and individual skill, Americans built a system that allowed ordinary men to deliver extraordinary results. The difference began with doctrine. German tactics had been forged in the Blitzkrieg campaigns of the early war, where highly trained crews and officers achieved breakthroughs with speed and surprise. But by the time they faced the United States in Normandy, conditions had changed. Germany was on the defensive, its resources stretched thin, and its commanders still tried to fight, using methods that depended on initiative and local superiority. The Americans approached battle differently. Instead of relying on small numbers of expert soldiers, they relied on coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. Each branch was strong on its own, but together they created a synergy that overwhelmed even the most experienced enemy. Mobility was the foundation of this approach. American forces treated movement as their greatest weapon. Shermans were not as heavily armed as Panthers or Tigers, but they were lighter, faster, and more reliable. Crews were trained to use that speed to outmaneuver German tanks rather than meet them head-on. When a Panther opened fire at long range, American units did not sit and trade shells. They flanked, spread out, and called in artillery or airstrikes. Mobility meant never fighting on German terms. A battle that began as a duel could quickly turn into a coordinated assault from multiple directions, with tanks, infantry, and aircraft striking in sequence. Coordination was what transformed mobility into victory. American units placed enormous emphasis on communication. Radios were standard in every tank, every command vehicle, and many infantry units. This meant that a company commander could speak directly to his platoon leaders, artillery observers, or even aircraft overhead. German tanks often had only a single radio in the command vehicle, leaving other crews to rely on signals or guesswork. In practice, this meant American forces could shift tactics in real time, adapting to changes on the battlefield within minutes. When a Sherman crew spotted a Tiger, they could report its position, call in artillery, and maneuver other units into ambush positions almost instantly. German veterans might have had more personal experience, but they often fought in isolation, unable to match the coordinated response of American formations. The true strength of the American system lay in combined arms. Infantry never attacked alone, tanks never advanced without support, and artillery was never far behind. A typical assault would begin with a thunderous barrage from field guns and mortars, softening enemy positions and breaking their morale. Then, Shermans rolled forward with infantry riding on their decks or advancing alongside, protecting one another from threats the other could not see. If German armor appeared, tank destroyers or aircraft were called in to engage. This seamless integration of forces created a rhythm of battle that German troops struggled to counter. Even when they destroyed tanks or repelled infantry, another wave of coordinated firepower soon followed. Examples of these tactics can be seen across Europe. In Normandy, American units faced German defenders who had spent weeks fortifying hedgerows with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. At first, Green American troops suffered heavy losses trying to break through, but they adapted. Infantry learned to work in small teams, advancing under cover of tank fire. Tanks used their mobility to smash through hedgerow walls, creating surprise openings for attacks. Artillery observers coordinated with every movement, ensuring that German counterattacks were met with devastating barrages. Within weeks, the hedgerows that had seemed impossible became a battlefield where Americans used teamwork and firepower to grind down even the most skilled defenders. One of the clearest demonstrations came during the breakout from Normandy in Operation Cobra. German units, including veteran panzer divisions, had prepared to resist an American advance. But instead of slow attrition, the Americans unleashed overwhelming air power combined with rapid armored thrusts. Thousands of bombers dropped explosives in a concentrated corridor, shattering German lines. Then, infantry and tanks poured through with speed and coordination that the defenders could not match. Experienced German commanders tried to regroup, but they were facing not individual battles, but a synchronized assault on a scale they could not stop. In less than a week, the German front in Normandy collapsed, not because their soldiers lacked experience, but because their tactics could not counter the integrated power of American arms. Mobility also allowed Americans to exploit their logistical strength. German veterans often tried to fight defensive battles, withdrawing to stronger positions and counterattacking when the enemy was vulnerable. But American forces moved too quickly. Motorized columns carried infantry far faster than German foot soldiers could retreat. Supply convoys kept pace with advancing tanks, ensuring fuel and ammunition never ran dry. Air superiority meant that even during pauses, American units were protected from large-scale counterattacks. German commanders complained that they could never rest, that every time they tried to regroup, American forces appeared again from another direction. This relentless mobility neutralized much of the advantage that experience once gave the Wehrmacht. Battlefield maneuvers highlighted the ingenuity of these tactics. In the Lorraine campaign of 1944, American tankers faced Panthers dug into defensive positions. Instead of frontal assaults, they used diversionary attacks to fix the Germans in place while flanking units struck from the sides. Artillery rained down on German strongpoints the moment they revealed themselves. When weather cleared, fighter bombers swooped in to finish the job. German crews who had fought for years on the Eastern Front found themselves destroyed not by single duels of tank against tank, but by an entire system designed to exploit their every weakness. Another striking example came during the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, surprising thin American lines. At first, the situation looked dire. Veteran German units broke through, overwhelming inexperienced American divisions. But the response showcased the strength of American coordination. Small units held key crossroads, delaying the advance with artillery and stubborn defense. Communications allowed commanders to redirect reserves rapidly, plugging gaps before they widened. Air support, once weather cleared, devastated German supply lines and armor columns. Within weeks, the offensive had stalled, and the initiative returned to the Allies. German veterans had achieved surprise, but American tactics, flexibility, and coordination turned the tide. The psychological effect of combined arms warfare was enormous. German soldiers reported feeling overwhelmed, not by the skill of individual opponents, but by the sense that every move they made triggered a larger response. Attack a tank and artillery would fall within minutes, fire at infantry, and aircraft might appear overhead. Even veteran troops, hardened by years of combat, found themselves demoralized by the relentlessness of American tactics. It was not one enemy, but an entire machine pressing down on them, coordinated, adaptable, and impossible to stop with isolated acts of bravery. American commanders encouraged initiative within this system. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to make quick decisions, supported by communications that allowed them to call on higher-level firepower when needed. A lieutenant leading an infantry platoon could request artillery support directly. A tank commander could radio for airstrikes without waiting for lengthy approval. This decentralized flexibility allowed the Americans to seize opportunities faster than their opponents. German veterans, trained in rigid hierarchies, often hesitated or waited for orders. By the time those orders arrived, the battlefield had shifted under the weight of American mobility. It is important to note that these tactics did not eliminate losses. American units suffered heavily in many engagements, particularly early on when facing seasoned defenders. But the system absorbed those losses and adapted. Each battle taught lessons that spread quickly through standardized training and equipment. What began as costly trial and error soon became a rhythm of combined arms that grew more effective with every campaign. German veterans, who once dismissed the Americans as inexperienced, soon admitted that they were facing an opponent unlike any they had fought before. An enemy whose strength lay not in individual brilliance, but in a coordinated system that turned fresh troops into effective soldiers almost overnight. By 1945, the difference was unmistakable. American units were advancing across Europe with a tempo that German forces could not resist. Veteran tank commanders admitted that their experience counted for little against an opponent who could maneuver faster, coordinate more effectively, and call upon overwhelming firepower at any moment. The Wehrmacht's tradition of individual skill and tactical excellence had met its match in the industrial age of warfare, where mobility, coordination, and combined arms mattered more than years of personal combat. The lesson of those campaigns is clear. Experience is valuable, but in modern war, it can be outweighed by a system designed to maximize every advantage. The Americans proved that ordinary soldiers, trained quickly and supported by mobility and coordination, could defeat veterans who had fought for years. Their tactics neutralized German strengths, exploited their weaknesses, and created a style of warfare that overwhelmed even the most skilled defenders. This was not just a triumph of technology or numbers, but of doctrine, a recognition that in total war, victory belongs to those who can integrate every weapon, every soldier, and war is often imagined as a contest of skill, where the most experienced soldiers with the best weapons will always prevail. But by the final years of the Second World War, the United States proved a different truth. In modern conflict, victory could be achieved not through individual brilliance, but through numbers, firepower, and relentless innovation. German tank crews, veterans of campaigns stretching back to 1939, faced Americans who had been civilians just months earlier. Yet it was the Germans who fell back, who watched their supposedly superior machines destroyed, and who discovered that no amount of experience could withstand the scale of American power. The story of this transformation is the story of how overwhelming firepower, unmatched logistics, and constant adaptation crushed an enemy that had once seemed invincible. The most visible symbol of this approach was the Sherman tank. Critics often point out that on paper it was inferior to the German Panther and Tiger. Its armor was thinner, its gun less powerful, and in a head-to-head duel it seemed outmatched. Yet the Sherman was never meant to fight as a duelist. It was designed to be built in staggering numbers, to be reliable, and to be improved over time. American factories produced nearly 50,000 of them, a number the Germans could never hope to match. For every Tiger that rolled off an assembly line, dozens of Shermans were waiting. This meant that American commanders could throw armor into battle knowing that losses would be replaced. A German crew might spend years mastering its Tiger, but once destroyed, it was gone forever. The American crew that lost a Sherman would often be in a new tank within days back in the fight. Numbers alone, however, did not win the war. The United States constantly upgraded its equipment to adapt to battlefield realities. When German armor proved resistant to the Sherman's original 75mm gun, the M4 was fitted with a higher velocity 76mm weapon. The British introduced the Firefly variant, mounting a powerful 17-pounder gun capable of piercing even the thick frontal armor of a Tiger. American forces adopted these innovations rapidly, mixing upgraded Shermans into their formations so that when German heavy tanks appeared, there was always an answer. This adaptability contrasted sharply with the German approach. Panthers and Tigers were technically advanced but slow to modify, requiring specialized factories and parts that were increasingly unavailable as the war dragged on. The Americans, by contrast, could retool production lines quickly, incorporating new ideas without halting the flow of tanks to the front. Artillery was another decisive factor. The U.S. Army treated its artillery not as background support, but as the backbone of every battle. German veterans described American artillery as the most terrifying weapon they faced. With superior communications and vast numbers of guns, American units could call down fire within minutes on any identified target. The famous time-on-target technique allowed shells from multiple batteries to arrive simultaneously, overwhelming defenders with sudden devastation. Even experienced German crews found themselves paralyzed under this storm of steel. They could not maneuver, they could not regroup, and often they could not even respond before a new barrage began. The ability to coordinate artillery so effectively came from a combination of training, technology, and logistics factors that the Americans possessed in abundance and the Germans increasingly lacked. Air power magnified this advantage. By 1944, the skies of Western Europe belonged to the Allies. American fighter bombers such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang roamed freely, striking convoys, supply depots, and even individual tanks. German crews, who might once have relied on camouflage or ambush, found that the roar of engines overhead meant sudden death from above. The coordination between ground forces and air support was crucial. Forward observers could call in airstrikes on German positions, and within minutes, bombs and rockets would fall. This integration of air power into ground operations gave American units a dimension of strength that German veterans could not match. Even when German tanks survived artillery and ground assaults, they were often picked off by aircraft that circled relentlessly overhead. Logistics, often overlooked in discussions of war, was perhaps the most decisive American advantage. Every Sherman needed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, and the U.S. ensured these were delivered in quantities that defied imagination. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system of trucks running day and night, carried supplies from ports to the front with clockwork regularity. German commanders complained bitterly that while their units starved for fuel and shells, the Americans seemed never to run out. Even in the chaos of rapid advances, American forces kept their tanks supplied, their artillery firing, and their infantry fed. This meant that battles could be sustained for days or weeks without collapse. German units, by contrast, often fought brilliantly for short periods, but were forced to withdraw when supplies ran dry. No amount of experience could make up for an empty fuel tank or a silent gun. Innovation extended beyond tanks and artillery. Small arms, communications equipment, and even medical care were constantly improved. The M1 Garand rifle gave every American infantryman semi-automatic firepower, allowing them to put out far more bullets than German counterparts armed with bolt-action rifles. Portable radios ensured that units remained in contact even in chaotic battles, enabling real-time coordination. Medical evacuation systems, using jeeps and aircraft, meant that wounded soldiers could be treated quickly, preserving morale and returning many to the fight. These innovations, while less dramatic than a tank duel, added up to a cumulative advantage that wore down even the toughest opponents. One of the clearest demonstrations of overwhelming numbers and innovation came during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. German forces, including some of their most experienced divisions, attempted to retreat from encirclement. American artillery, airstrikes, and armored thrusts created a killing ground where experience meant nothing. Columns of German vehicles were torn apart by waves of bombs and barrages. Crews who had fought since the invasion of the Soviet Union found themselves helpless against the sheer scale of Allied firepower. The destruction was so complete that survivors described it as the death of the German army in the West. Another powerful example was the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. German commanders believed the river to be an unbreachable barrier. Yet American innovation produced solutions that defied expectations. amphibious vehicles, pontoon bridges built in record time, and coordinated assaults supported by artillery and airstrikes turned the river into just another obstacle to be brushed aside. German units, already depleted, could not believe the speed and efficiency with which the Americans moved men and machines across. Even experienced defenders realized that they were facing not just soldiers, but an industrial machine that had turned warfare into a science of relentless progress. The psychological impact of this combination of numbers and innovation was immense. German veterans spoke of fighting bravely, destroying tanks and holding positions, only to see fresh waves of Shermans roll forward, supported by artillery and aircraft. The realization that the enemy could replace every loss while they themselves dwindled was devastating. A Tiger crew might destroy several Shermans in a battle, but the next day more would appear. A Panther division might repel an attack, but the Americans would regroup with new tactics and heavier support. Experience taught the Germans how to fight battles, but innovation and numbers allowed the Americans to fight wars and to win them. It is easy to romanticize the idea of superior weapons or elite soldiers, but the American system proved that adaptability and mass production were the true keys to victory. Every innovation, from upgraded guns to better radios, was multiplied across thousands of units. Every logistical solution fed millions of soldiers. Every lesson learned was standardized and spread quickly. This ability to adapt on a national scale overwhelmed an enemy that relied too heavily on the prowess of individual crews and commanders. By the final months of the war, the contrast was stark. American columns stretched across Europe, tanks rumbling forward in endless streams, supported by aircraft overhead and artillery behind. German defenders, no matter how skilled, were isolated, undersupplied, and outmatched. Even the most experienced crews admitted that they could not keep up. What good was expertise when your tank ran out of fuel, your guns were silenced by barrages, and the enemy always had more men, more machines, and more firepower? The victory of the United States in Europe was not an accident. It was the product of overwhelming numbers, sustained logistics, and continuous innovation. It was the triumph of a system designed to make war winnable by ordinary soldiers, equipped with extraordinary support. It was proof that in modern conflict, no amount of individual experience could stand against the weight of an entire nation mobilized for victory. The Germans had skill, courage, and years of hard fighting behind them, but the Americans had the future of warfare on their side, an integrated system of industry, tactics, and adaptation that crushed every opponent in its path. And that is why, in the end, even the most experienced German crews could not keep up. They were fighting the last war, while the United States was already fighting the next one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how America won through firepower, logistics, and innovation, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more history brought to life, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think numbers and technology always win wars, or can experience still decide the outcome? I'd love to hear your perspective.